I work the night shift at a small, rundown gas station on the edge of a highway that hardly sees any traffic past midnight. It's a mediocre place at best. No security cameras, half the lights flickering like they're dying, and a bathroom that no one in their right mind would use. Most of the time, my shift is dead silent. Truckers stop to grab coffee and stretch their legs, and locals come in every once in a while, but after 1 a.m., the place becomes a ghost town. It's just me, the buzzing of the old fluorescent lights, and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. That's why it stood out immediately when someone walked in on foot at exactly 2 a.m. I was leaning back in my chair, absently flicking through my phone when the chime above the door rang. I barely looked up at first, expecting the usual, a trucker grabbing coffee, some lost traveler asking for directions. But when I finally glanced toward the entrance, I saw him for the first time. No headlights in the lot. No car idling at the pumps. Just the man standing in the doorway, dripping in the station's sickly fluorescent lights. He was thin, hunched slightly like he'd been walking for miles. His clothes were ordinary enough. Dark jeans stained with leaves and mud at the bottom. A gray hoodie pulled over his head. He smelled faintly of gasoline. He took slow, dragging steps toward the counter. I cleared my throat. "Hey man, how's it going?" No response. "You need something?" He didn't blink, just reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and set it on the counter. "1 gallon, he muttered with a hoarse voice. I waited for him to say something else, maybe explain why he was on foot or where his car was, but he just stood there. "You good, dude?" I tried again, ringing up the sale. Nothing. I slid his change across the counter, and he picked it up without counting it. Outside, through the station's dirty front windows, I watched him take an old, battered jerry can from beside the pumps. The thing was weathered, sun-bleached, cracked in spots. I figured he probably had a car stranded nearby. Maybe he was just mad or embarrassed. Honestly, I didn't care. As long as he paid, whatever he did with the fuel wasn't my problem. The next night, at exactly 2 a.m., the door chime rang again. I looked up from where I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter, my stomach twisting before I fully registered why. It was him. Same hunched posture. I set the carton of smokes down and straightened up, watching him closely as he stepped forward and wordlessly slipped the same crumpled $20 bill across the counter. "1 gallon, he muttered. I hesitated before punching the sale. Something about him didn't feel right. "You got a car this time?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He didn't respond. His fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the counter. I licked my lips and rang him up, keeping my eye on his face as I slid his change across the counter. But he didn't even glance down. He just grabbed the coins and left. Outside, I watched through the grimy front window as he made his way back toward the pumps. He picked up his can and filled it carefully, watching as the fuel poured into the old, cracked plastic. That's when I noticed his hands. They were grimy, dark stains beneath his nails, like he'd been working with oil. This time, I paid attention. Instead of heading toward the highway, where I expected to see him disappear into the distance like any normal person, he turned. Not toward the road, not toward a car, but toward the woods. I frowned. There was nothing out there. The tree line was thick, a wall of blackened trunks and twisted branches that loomed just beyond the glow of the station's flickering lights. No trails, no houses, no nearby gas station or mechanic shop. Just endless, suffocating darkness. And yet, that's where he went. I just watched him go, my heart hammering in my chest as he stepped past the last pump, past the edge of the lot, his feet crunching against the dead grass. He never hesitated, never glanced over his shoulder, never acknowledged that he was leaving the only light for miles behind him. He just kept walking, and then the darkness swallowed him whole. I stood there, frozen behind the counter, staring out at the woods for what felt like an eternity. A part of me expected, hoped, to see something. A car parked just beyond the trees. Flashlights in the distance. A flicker of movement that would tell me where the hell he was going every night. But there was nothing. Only the stillness of the trees. Only the suffocating silence. Only the creeping sense of dread curling up my spine. The rest of my shift passed in a haze. I barely registered the occasional trucker who wandered in. My mind was still locked on him. On the way he disappeared into the trees like he'd done it 1,000 times before. By the time my shift ended, the sun was beginning to rise, spilling pale gold light over the empty lot. I hesitated before stepping outside, staring toward the tree line one last time. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew whatever was out there, whatever he was going to, was not normal. And the worst part? He came back the next night. And the night after that. And the night after that. A week passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. He had become a part of my routine, the same way the flickering lights and busted coffee machine had. Every night, exactly at 2 a.m., he would appear. Never early, never late, always on time. I started paying closer attention. I listened for a car approaching in the distance before he arrived. There never was one. I checked behind the station in case he was parking somewhere out of sight. Nothing. I even stepped outside once, right before 2 a.m., scanning the road, the highway, the darkened lots beyond the station, searching for any sign of him before he arrived. But there was never anything there, just empty asphalt. And then, at exactly 2 a.m., I would hear the chime above the door, and he would be there. Then one night, a regular trucker named Frank stopped in for coffee and smokes. Frank was the type of guy who talked to fill the silence. Normally, I let him ramble, nodding along as I half listened. But that night, as he stirred sugar into his coffee, he glanced out toward the empty parking lot. "Hey," he muttered. "You still getting that weird guy at 2?" I nearly dropped the pack of cigarettes in my hand. "Wait, you've seen him?" Frank shrugged. "Couple nights back. Thought it was weird. Didn't see a car. Just walked right up and bought gas." My fingers clenched around the carton. "Did you see where he went?" Frank shook his head. "Didn't stick around. Just paid for my coffee and left. But the whole thing gave me the creeps, you know?" He took another sip before muttering, "Creepy guy, ain't he?" A few nights later, an older man came in looking for a can of Fix-A-Flat. He was probably in his mid-60s, wearing a denim jacket that looked just as worn out as he did. As he was paying, the hooded man walked in. The same routine. The same crumpled $20 bill. The same hoarse mutter of 1 gallon. But the older guy didn't just ignore him like most customers did. He watched, his brow furrowed, his weathered face tightening as the hooded man turned and walked back out into the night. And then, after a long pause, he squinted toward the trees and muttered, "Huh." I frowned. "What?" The man rubbed a hand over his jaw, his gaze still following the figure as he disappeared into the woods. "I've been in this area a long time now," he said slowly. "Still see him here frequently." My stomach dropped. "How long is a long time?" The man turned, his expression serious now. "Long time," he said simply. "And the strangest thing?" He paused, lowering his voice. "That guy doesn't seem to age." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean?" The man sighed. "First time I saw him, I was a kid. My dad used to bring me here when he stopped for coffee. I remember seeing him, exact same hoodie, exact same can, exact same goddamn time. And when I started driving, I still saw him. Every time I came through here. Always the same. Always 1 gallon. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And the weirdest part?" I swallowed. "What?" He turned to me, eyes dark and tired. "He still looks the same as he did when I was a kid." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because that didn't make sense. That meant he had been coming here for decades. That meant the man I was looking at, who couldn't have been older than 30, hadn't aged in 40 years. The old man let out a long sigh. "If he does age, boy does he age well." And then, without another word, he left. That night, after my shift ended, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my chest. I had never believed in ghosts, never believed in haunted places. But now, sitting alone in my car, staring at the darkness beyond the trees, I wasn't so sure anymore. Because if what that old man said was true, then the guy buying 1 gallon of gas every night for decades wasn't human. And whatever he was still out there. I don't know what pushed me over the edge that night. Maybe it was the trucker, Frank, casually mentioning the hooded man like it was normal. Maybe it was the old man's warning, the way his voice had dropped as he muttered, "That guy doesn't seem to age." Or maybe, just maybe, it was the fact that after weeks of watching, waiting, and second-guessing myself, I was finally ready to get some damn answers. It was a cold, windless night. The kind of night where sound carried too far, where every footstep felt too loud, where even the whisper of breath could be heard in the dead silence. I waited until I saw him fade into the tree line, just like always, before I grabbed the cheap flashlight from under the counter. For the first time, I stepped out from behind the register and into the night. As soon as my boots hit the gravel lot, I felt it. That unnatural silence. Inside the gas station, There was the hum of the drink coolers, the flickering of the neon open sign, the occasional static from the old radio. But out here, nothing. No cars, no wind rustling the trees, no chirping insects, just the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of the hooded man's slow, deliberate footsteps ahead of me. He didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just kept walking, and I followed. The further we went, the stronger the smell of gasoline became. At first, I thought maybe it was just his clothes. A guy like that, hauling fuel around every night, of course he'd smell like it. But no, this was different. The air itself was thick with it. Not just fresh fuel, either. The stale, sour scent of old spills mixed with something burned. I could feel it coating the inside of my mouth, seeping into my clothes, clinging to my skin like an oil slick. Ahead, the trees started to thin. I saw the clearing. I stopped at the edge, heart hammering. And for the first time, I saw what he had been walking toward all along. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across. The ground was dry, cracked dirt, littered with gas cans, some rusted and crushed, others new, still full. And in the center of it all, a car. Or at least, what was left of one. The body was completely burned out, the metal twisted and warped from extreme heat. Whatever color it had once been was long gone, the surface now scorched black and crumbling. The windows were blown out, the edges melted, warped from the flames. The tires, what little remained of them, were nothing more than charred rubber fused to the dirt. And inside, bones. A skeleton was still strapped into the driver's seat, the seatbelt melted across the ribcage, the remains of charred fingers fused to the steering wheel. The skull had tilted slightly, as if watching me through the hollowed-out sockets. My stomach lurched. I couldn't breathe. And then I saw him. The hooded man was kneeling beside the car, gripping a rusted, cracked gas can, tipping it into the car's open fuel tank. I could see the fuel pouring in, but it didn't matter, because the tank was destroyed, melted through, gaping with rusted holes. The fuel simply spilled out the bottom, soaking into the dirt, darkening the ground beneath him. But he didn't stop. He just kept pouring. And then, for the first time, I heard his voice. Low, ragged, desperate. It's never enough. The words were barely a whisper, trembling, pleading. It's never enough to leave. He dropped to his knees, hands scooping at the dirt, trying to shovel the spilled gasoline back into the car with his bare hands. How much more fuel do I need? Why won't it let me leave? His voice rose, cracking into something unnatural, something broken, something wrong. And then, he froze. His head turned. His yellowed, bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. And for the first time, he spoke to me directly. Do you know why it won't start? His voice was hoarse, thin, like the last gasp of a dying fire. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't answer. His fingers twitched. His eyes twitched. And then, slowly, his lips peeled back into something almost like a smile. But it wasn't right. It was strained. Wrong. Like his face wasn't used to making expressions. You know what I have to do, don't you? I shook my head. I don't know. His fingers curled into fists. And then, from the pocket of his hoodie, he pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, the same one I had seen him hand over every single night. 1 gallon. He took a step toward me. Then another. Then, he lunged. I stumbled back as he clawed at the air between us, his voice twisting into something inhuman, desperate, shrieking. 1 gallon. Just 1 more gallon, and I can go home. His hands lunged for me, fingers grasping, face contorting. I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear him screaming, a wet, ragged howl of frustration. I just need 1 more gallon. The trees blurred past me, shadows twisting and snapping under the weak beam of my flashlight. The smell of gasoline burned my nose, clung to my skin, thick and suffocating. I could hear something behind me. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was just the echo of my own footsteps. But I didn't stop to find out. The glow of the gas station's neon lights appeared ahead. I hit the gravel lot at full speed, nearly collapsing onto my knees as I stumbled through the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it without thinking. Outside, the lot was empty. The trees were still, and the man never came back. I didn't go back the next night, or the night after that. I quit. No notice. Didn't care. A week later, as I was leaving town, I passed the gas station. And through the window, I saw him, still buying exactly 1 gallon, still walking into the woods. And just like every other night, he never looked back.